funds in their place. How do we present that? How do we do it in a way to where it makes sense for the client, it makes sense for their budget, and at the end of the day, you walk out with a sale and you're protecting the family at the same time and providing them coverage. But how do we go about showing the value in that without making it seem like, oh, it's just a small policy? How do we build that value? And that's what we're going to talk about today. So we have a very special guest today, and he's actually been with Equus Financial for a little while now. Actually, he came here in fall of 2017, and since then, he has been pretty consistent, to say the least. And he is a Diamond Elite Producer and Senior Sales Manager. So he's not just an elite producer, he is also building his agency and growing, which is awesome. It's a great path to be on. And just to give some of his numbers, so far this year, he has issued 194 applications for $241,000, and he has an 85% placement. So that means 85% of the applications that he submits are getting issued. So that's a good number. So I want to welcome to today's video our very special guest, David Crocker. I wish we had some applause and some, the crowd roaring in the background. We don't quite have that yet, but glad to have you on, Dave Crocker. Excited. Now, as far as our topic, we're going to jump right in because I know our people, they like us, they know us, but they want to hear the meat and potatoes, right? The brass tacks. So whenever it comes to your mindset and how you approach people that are maybe up there in age or maybe health-wise, they can't really qualify for a term option, how do you approach those in the home? And if you could dive right in and literally treat it like you're in the home with a family, how do you present that?
Sure, sounds good. So here's the dynamic that we experience is that, whether it's a dial-in lead or a mail-in lead, what is the expectation of the client as we're walking through that door? I think it's fair to say that a significant number of them, in fact, probably most, if not all, have in this mind that the person that's going to walk through into their house and help them is there to show them how to, quote unquote, pay off the mortgage if something happens. I think that's their mentality. And so in some respects, you might say, well, then I've got a little bit of an uphill climb, especially when I'm walking in and it's somebody in their late 60s, early 70s, even in their low 80s, who's got health conditions. How do I mentally pivot them and help them understand that we're not going to be paying off the mortgage? If they have $250,000 mortgage and they're in their 70s or 75, 80 years old, I rarely find a family that financially could afford those kinds of premiums, especially because 90% of the time there's been a medical event in the past that they're not going to qualify for, quote unquote, a term/mortgage protection policy. So the first thing before I get anywhere with a family is outside of the connection that we do face-to-face with them and visiting and meeting the dog and talking about the things that's in their china cabinet. But then to say, okay, so let's talk through some philosophy of why I'm here today. What are we trying to accomplish? Now so I'm going to do a little fact finding with you. And the reason I'm going to ask some of these questions as I do this fact finding is I want to, in my head, I'm going to shuffle around some different strategies we use as protection advisors because every family is different. As we go through this conversation, you're going to be different than the 350 families that I helped last year. And so every family has unique retirement, has unique savings, has unique assets in the bank or no assets in the bank, which is fine. Different health history, different ages, and different mortgage balances. So I'm going to ask you some questions. And then from that, I'm going to introduce some philosophies of how we approach how to help you today and the reason that I'm sitting here today. So the first question is, and I'm going to go through a family that I helped yesterday. So let's walk through real quick. What's your mortgage balance? Let's get that out there right now. Okay, so you owe, and I write this down on a piece of paper at the very top. So you owe $212,000. Okay, so 212. What do we think our equity is today? How much is, or I'm sorry, how much do we owe, or is the house worth? Okay, so 364, so 364. Okay, so I'm gonna write 364. And I'll show you this paper in a minute. Now, what is our monthly payment? Probably around $1,100, $1,200, $1,300 for 212. Okay, so 1,342 is your mortgage payment. Okay, so if I'm correct, we have a $212,000 balance on a house worth 364 with a $1,300 payment, and our equity position is basically right around 140 to 150,000 ish in equity. Sound about right? Okay, so this is what I end up on my piece of paper as the very first steps, if you can see that. Okay, this is what it looks like. Now, there's a different philosophy that we're going to use depending on what are we worried about. Sir, if something happens to you, we've got a significant amount of equity in the home that we want to protect. We have a mortgage payment that has to be made. What happens if the mortgage payment isn't made? After 90 days, we're in trouble, aren't we? So let's walk through a couple of things here. I do a little income exercise. I asked him, if this is a husband and wife that I'm sitting in front of, how much do you earn in a month? What does that look like? Is that Social Security? Okay. We have a pension. Okay. And then is there any survivor benefit to that would go to your spouse? So for instance, let's say he has a $1,200 Social Security payment, and let's say he has a $500 pension. Very, very small numbers. Okay. And she maybe has like a $500 Social Security payment. And then maybe he's got like a VA retirement, VA pension of like $2,300. Okay, so I'll write down what his income is and then what her income is, and then I'll ask them what is how much survivor benefit do we have? We know the Social Security would continue to you, ma'am. The 500, did you take the survivor benefit with your pension? Okay, you did. So she's going to get that 500, but the VA retirement is going to go away, right? Okay, so right now, if I'm doing my math right, ma'am, your income is going to be right around $2,000 a month if something happens to Mr. Johnson here. Am I correct on that? And what I'm doing by getting to that is I'm adding his Social Security, because yours would go away, and then his survivor benefit. So right around $1,700 to $2,000 a month is our income. So let me ask you this. What is our comfort level on making the mortgage payment if something happens to Mr. Johnson? We have a $1,300 mortgage payment and we're making $1,700 a month. What's our comfort level on that? What she says 99% of the time is that doesn't work. It doesn't work. And so then I ask her, and sometimes the numbers are different. Sometimes it's flipped the other way. Sometimes their income is relatively even. And I'll ask both of them the question. If something happens to her, what are you doing, sir? But this is the question. Oftentimes in these scenarios, this is where we end up, is if something happens to him, she's in a pickle. And so I ask her, if something happens to Mr. Johnson, what's next for you? Oh, I can't keep this house. That's why we have you here today, because I can't keep the house. Okay. Well, we're going to go through some ideas of how we can help protect against that. And a little bit about my background, just so you know. I sit with around 400 families a year. I helped last year around 350 families put a policy in place. I had 7 death claims last year. And so I'm very familiar with the pragmatics, of we're sitting here today, but unfortunately at some point, one of us is going to be gone. And so how do we take care of that? So I'm going to tell you a couple of stories of a couple of clients that I helped last year, or not last year, but over the last 4 years. So you can kind of see where I'm headed. And then I'm going to give you some ideas. And by the way, that little thing where I just mentioned there, I'm going to give you some ideas. I tell them that so that they know that I am going to come to a conclusion. I'm just not going to go on a long narrative here. There is a purpose for the stories that I'm going to tell. So I'm going to tell them. So let me tell you a couple of stories. About 3 or 4 years ago, I met with a family in their 70s. He was a retired fish and game wildlife warden, had a double lung transplant. And we sat there and I asked both of them, what happens to you if your loved one is gone? And what she told me was, and this was her quote, It would take an army of men with bazooka guns to drag me out of this house. In other words, I'm staying in this house. And they had a mortgage balance similar to what you have. And another lady in another family, I asked her, what are you doing? And she says, oh, I'm moving to Montana to be with my daughter. If he passes away, I'm gone. I'm going to go live with her. So let's fast forward about a year and a half, 2 years. Both those men passed away around the same time. And they were in your age group. And the lady that was going to stay in the house and it would take an army of men with bazooka guns called me after about 6 weeks and said, do you think anybody would look at me cross-eyed if I sold my house? I said, no, well, that'd be fine. Why would you be worried about that? She goes, well, I remember telling you I'm staying in the house, but after 6 weeks here alone of him being gone, Tim being gone, I can't stay here. There's too many memories. I'm not going to be able to keep up the yard. I'm going to sell. I'm going to use my equity. And I found a condo in downtown Olympia, Washington that I'm going to buy, and I'm going to go move in there. So even though I told you I was going to stay, I'm actually going to leave. The lady that moved to Montana, I talked to her, or was going to move to Montana. She said, I said I was going to go to Montana, but my daughter and her husband are going through a terrible divorce. I don't want to get anywhere near that. And my best friend, her husband just passed away from my church. And she's actually going to sell her house and she's going to come move in with me and rent for me. So I'm going to stay. So what I've learned, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, what I've learned about this is that we don't know what life looks like after this happens. We don't know what it's going to be like for us to be alone. We've been married a long time. And so what I have learned as an advisor is we need to have good options that help us so that we can decide what's best for us without the pressure of this mortgage payment. Let me ask you a question. If that mortgage payment is not made for 90 days, what happens? House gets foreclosed on. If we are coming home from a funeral and we're dealing with the emotional grief of all of that, and then suddenly we've got to sit there and, now I've got to scramble and figure out how to make my mortgage payment. What's our comfort level in being in that situation? It's not very good. Okay, so I'm going to introduce a couple of ideas, and I'm going to tell you my philosophy as we go through these ideas. My philosophy is less is more. Okay, and by that I mean, if you remember back in the early 70s, there was the story of the semi truck that got stuck in one of the tunnels in New York City, and they couldn't get it unstuck. They spent 6, 7, 8 hours working on getting it unstuck. They couldn't get it unstuck, and a kid riding by in a car asked one of their parents, who told the flagger, "Why don't they just take the air out of the tires?" And they did. And so I kind of look at this whole scenario here of what I'm going to suggest is kind of let's take the air out of the tires. And the reason we do that is because it can make a very cost-effective way to make sure that we're not dealing with the scramble of our mortgage payment. We're not dealing with the scramble of the worry of how do we make our decisions on if I'm going to stay, if I'm going to go. So there's a concept we use in mortgage protection that when I meet with people in your age group called critical period. And what that means is that my loved one is gone. I am now in a critical period in my life. I've got some serious decisions to make. Do I want to come home from a funeral and suddenly have to put a for sale sign up in front of the house because I can't make the mortgage payment? Or do I want to suddenly deal with, I need to find a renter, or I need to refinance, or whatever it is? And so with the critical period idea, the idea is, could I take the financial worry out of a period of time so that, number one, and let's be honest, let's be pragmatic for a minute. We're going to grieve, all right? This is not an easy process. We've been married for 35, 40 years, 50 years. So we're going to sit there and we're going to throw ashes on our head and stare at the corner of the bedroom for a little while, the walls, while we kind of adjust to what's next, okay? So that's a terrible time for us to be making strong financial decisions. And I think if you've talked to other financial advisors, which I'm sure you have, a lot of them have told you, we want to make sure that we don't make any strong financial decisions for at least a year if something happens, right? So when I look at a policy for something that might help you, I'm looking for something that can take out the financial worry number one. Number two, something that follows my philosophy of taking the air out of the tires. Less is more. Okay. You've got a big equity position of 150,000 in your house. That's the part that worries me the most. We have a $1,300 mortgage payment. If that payment isn't made, we're in trouble. So let's talk through a couple of ideas on what critical period looks like. Now, here's the pros and cons of a critical period approach to mortgage protection. The pros is that we're going to be able to put something in place that's a permanent policy. It's never going to expire. You're 74, Mr. Johnson. Just our luck. We take out a policy that expires in 10 years or 15 years, and then you live 10 or 15 years in a day. I don't like the idea of paying a lot of money into a policy that might not be there when we need it, right? So a critical period policy checks a box for me, and that is permanent. And I write this down. So, and by the way, I noticed my camera was bouncing when I was writing, so I'll do this holding it. So what I'm looking for is a policy that's permanent, and I write down permanent on my piece of paper. I also want to see if I can find a policy where the premiums never change. I do not want a policy, and you'll find these often like policies you get through credit unions or through like group policies through like AARP and such, where you turn 75 and your premium goes up, or you turn 80 and your premium goes up. I refuse to do those kinds of policies on people in your age group. So what I want to do is I want to find a policy where the premiums stay the same and the value of the policy stays the same. And then finally, you had prostate cancer 8 years ago, you had a heart attack back in your late 50s. I want to find a policy that underwriting wise is going to be friendly to you with your medical history without requiring you to take a medical exam. Okay, so 3 check boxes: permanent, everything stays the same, and is friendly to you from being able to qualify. And then also, what's the least expensive way to do this? You're on a limited budget. What's the least expensive way to do this? So what a critical period policy does for you, it checks those 3 boxes. And what it does is it answers the question, if my loved one is gone, how am I going to make the mortgage payment? And what we do is we set up a program for you to where if your husband, your spouse is gone, the mortgage is paid for 6 months before we have to worry about anything. Would it make sense to have a policy in place that if he's gone, I don't have to worry about the mortgage for a year or 6 months or 18 months or 24 months? Would it make sense? Now I beat him to the punch. Now I understand in that approach, we're not necessarily attacking paying off the mortgage. But remember, if we go back to our previous conversation where I asked you, what are you going to do? Most oftentimes the lady does say, I'm probably not going to be able to stay just because of the mortgage payment, or the house is too big. I'm not going to be able to keep up with it. So a lot of times they say, I'm probably going to sell anyway. But even if they don't, say, well, but maybe we have some options of how to stay. But if we could make sure the mortgage payment is covered, then we don't have to worry about that for a year. We have found that gives a nice professional person like yourself the peace of mind and the time to figure out how to address next steps. So would it make sense to have a policy in place that the mortgage is paid for 6 months or for a year? Would it make sense to do that? For instance, let me show you how we build these. Let's say, for instance, we had, and I'm going to show some simple numbers here. Remember, we're taking the air out of the tires. What if we had a little policy of just like a little $10,000 policy? Now you've got a $1,300 mortgage payment. So let's do the math. $1,300, $10,000 policy divided by 1342. That's 7 months of the mortgage pay. Basically 6 months. So let's say it's 6 months. What if we did a $15,000 policy? That would be 9 months. What if we did a $20,000 policy? That would be right about a year. What if we did a 25? That would be around 15 months. So I write these out on a row. What if we did something like that? Now, and then this is what I tell them. Now, when I write these out, I'm not looking at the face amount of the policy. There is smaller numbers, but I'm not looking at that. What I'm looking at is the time that it gives me to grieve, to deal with just adjusting to my new life, decide if I'm going to stay or not. Okay. So it gives me the time to do that. And so when I'm looking at a $15,000 policy, I'm looking at 9 months. I'm looking at $20,000. I'm looking at a year of time. Now, the nice thing about a policy like these is it does check all those boxes. They're permanent. The premiums stay the same. The underwriting is friendly to your medical history, Mr. Johnson. And here's the other thing that I know, having done this a lot. If I'm sitting across from a family in their 70s, if I write down a $10,000 critical period number, I know that the premium on that's going to be under $100. One of the things that I've learned is that people in their age group are expecting when I walk in that what I'm going to show them is going to be $200, $300, $400 a month. And so the fact that I can show the very first number under 100, that to me is the most critical thing from my perspective. I know a lot of other people start with the higher number and go backwards. And that's fine. I start the other way. I start at the bottom. If I'm sitting across from somebody who's 80, I also make sure I show them a $5,000 and then a $7,500 policy because I want to show them a couple of options under 100. All right, because they're not expecting that. All right, so what it does is it just relaxes them. Oh, I'm actually going to be able to do something today. I was thinking I was going to have to spend $200, $300, $400. I'm not going to have to do that. So in my mind, it kind of sets the tone for the rest of the conversation. So then I say, okay, now the expectation here, I'm obviously the elephant in the room is what does this cost? So we'll go through what these costs are. And by the way, a lot of these companies will let us go to $30,000, $35,000, or $45,000. That's fine if you want to look at those higher numbers. But in my take the air out of the tires approach, I like to keep things down in that lower amount. You're more than welcome to drag me kicking and screaming into a higher premium if you're comfortable with that. But my rule on that is this. Let's say it's Christmas time and you're driving to Target to get the grandkids Christmas presents and the transmission falls out of your car. I don't want to get a phone call from you on the side of the road. Hey, I need to cancel my critical period policy because I can't afford it because I got to fix my car. In other words, let's find a premium in here that is comfortable so that if something happens financially to us later on, this isn't the thing we cancel because just our luck, we cancel it and then the next day we have a heart attack. Okay. And if you'll notice what I did there is I kind of transitioned from making a decision about if we're going to do anything to what does life look like after we have the policy. So I just kind of rolled right into that next thing. So let me take a minute. Let me write out what the premiums are. And I'm just going to, instead of taking the time on my calculator here, I'm just going to write them out. So let's say a $10,000 policy is 75, 15 is like 110, 20 might be 160, 25 might be 190. I'm just randomly picking numbers out of the air. And then once I have them written out, I ask the question, now, if you were to do something, what on here might feel comfortable? And then I turn the paper around and I sit in front of them, say, teach me, tell me what fits the two of you the best. Okay. Oftentimes the guy might just throw in I got to think about it right there. But a lot of times the lady says, I really like this. I would have a lot of peace of mind if I knew that the mortgage was covered for a year. If I knew that even 6 months, this is less expensive than I thought it was going to be, blah, 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 blah. That tends to be the direction this goes. Now, let's go, and Brandon, I think we got a couple extra minutes here. Let's go a little deeper on some other ideas we could throw in there. If you have a health license, if the conversation comes up, well, yeah, but what about paying off my house? If they're under the age of 70, I oftentimes will supplement this idea. I'll teach them about how to use an accident plan that could pay off the house. I'll use that as a supplement. I'll bring that idea in if they're really hung up on something like that. They're so hung up on paying off the house. And then they might say, well, what about a policy that pays off the house? I said, well, let's look at that for a minute. Now, if we look at a policy like that, I'll tell you that it's going to expire. So it's not going to check that permanent box. It's going to be a lot more expensive. For instance, if we did a policy like that, even if we could qualify, the starting price on that is going to be around $200. And it's going to expire in 10 years, or $250 for something that's not going to give us the peace of mind we need. So I kind of answer the question, but then I move right back on to that really doesn't check those boxes. I don't think I've ever had a client, when I've taken this approach, talking more about the emotional time of what a critical period is. I don't think I've ever had a client say, no, I don't want that. I really want something that's going to pay off the house. Now, if we walk in and the focus is paying off the house, and well, I can't do that for you, but what I can do is this. Yeah, then you end up in a tug of war, and they're not going to move forward with the policy. But if instead we introduce the concepts and the ideas and what the peace of mind that would be created by a critical period policy would do, by the time we show the numbers, oftentimes they've kind of in their mind walked away from, I'm not paying off the house. All I'm worried about is making sure I've got the mortgage covered for a year or 6 months. So that tends to be the approach. I found that works the best if I take the time up front and nurse through the emotions of what life is going to look like when he's gone. Then that gives us the ability to bring critical period policy in, because it gives them the permanent policy. They don't have to worry about circling back. And it gives them the idea that if somebody turns 75, the premiums aren't going to go up, because I guarantee you they've had policies like that where the premiums have changed and they've canceled them. And then also they're worried. They had cancer, they had a heart attack. They don't even think they're going to qualify for anything. So anyway, I realize we're probably time-wise coming up against the clock here, but that's the approach I take, Brandon. That tends to carry the process through with what people need to get there. And of the death claims that I've had since I've started, every single one has been a critical period policy. Every single one. I have sat with people at a kitchen table, and as early as 6 months later, one of them's gone. It's been in 6 of the 7 instances, it was the husband. And so I tell them that. I just said, look, I know it's uncomfortable, but we're going to pragmatically talk about that one day we all sign up for when we get together. I realize, when we get married, that's, and we plan on these things, the one day we don't really talk about much is the day that person is gone. And so we're going to talk about that for the next 45 minutes to an hour. It's okay to do that. And I've walked families through that. In fact, I'm walking a family through that right now. And so, but here's how we can get there. Here's how we can protect your equity. And by the way, would it make sense to protect equity if we have the mortgage payment? Now we're not in a hurry if something happens. If the mortgage is paid and the market's down, we don't have to sell to the first guy that knocks on the door and says, hey, I'll buy your house at a discount. We don't have to do that. What if I just want to sit and rest for a few months? What if I need to do some things to improve the house, maybe put a roof on or something, so I can sell it at top dollar? Let's take the urgency out of that time, give ourselves time to grieve, and then we can move on with life and protect our equity by making sure that mortgage payment is covered.
Wow. That is pretty phenomenal. So I don't think there's any mystery as to how you've gotten to the numbers that you are at. And what's interesting is there's a couple things that I really take from your approach on this. The first one is, I can tell that you have built up a pretty emotional rapport with these people, that you've done a really good job asking questions, that you're not rushing through the appointment to get to the numbers, that you're really stopping to understand them as a couple and seeing the dynamic, to see how they think. And you've gotten to the critical period part knowing that how you're going to have to talk to them. If they're going to be receptive, or if you're going to have to be a little bit tougher with them. Or if, they started the conversation off talking about, well, we want to get this because we want something to pay it off. You've been able to kind of massage your way to the point where you're now talking about critical period and they're listening. They're not just closed up. And that's because you built that emotional rapport with them. The other thing that I noticed is that you used examples, and you brought up 2 of the big things that people come back with whenever it's, I guess I would call them maybe an objection that sometimes they come up with whenever we're talking about critical period. One being, well, I'm going to stay in the house, so having something that would pay my mortgage for, 6 months or 12 months or 2 years isn't going to be enough because I need it paid off because I plan on staying here. you knocked that one down with your story about the person who said that they're going to have to come in with bazookas to get me out of here, and she ended up calling you with her tail between her legs about it. So you gave that story without having to attack it. You gave it as a story. I love that. And then the other one where you're talking about where you really don't know how you're going to make decisions when that time comes until that time comes. I have people in claim process right now, and I've done plenty of death claims on critical period as well. And it's funny how whenever it comes time to claim it, they're like, "This is going to help me so much." Brandon, you have no idea how much this is going to help us pay the mortgage. Whenever we got it, I really didn't think it was going to be that big of a help, but right now I'm just so glad we put this in place. And it's so funny how it works out like that. But I want everybody who is watching this, and leaders, I hope that you guys get your people to watch these going forward, because what Dave Crocker just did is he showed our agents how to go in and look at these people like their family, not be pushy. I did not feel like a pressure salesperson type of environment with David. I didn't feel that. I felt like he was coming in, he was listening, he was trying to go from a place of understanding, and he wasn't pushing these people to do anything. He was simply talking about a concept. And lastly, and I'm going to close out with this, what you heard today is conceptual selling. What he did is he did not talk about, here's a $5,000 policy, here's a 10, here's a 15. He didn't say, this is how much the coverage is, which one do you want? What he pointed out is, let's not talk about what the coverage amount is, let's talk about what it does. How does this apply to you? And you can't get to the how this applies to you without slowing down and finding out more about your clients and paying attention to them. So, Dave, thank you so much. Do you have anything you want to add to close us out?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is take your time with the older crowd. I give myself, and some people might kill me for this, I give myself a 2-hour window on my calendar when I'm meeting with somebody who's 65 or older. They love to visit. They need that personal connection. I will spend 30, 45 minutes with them up front. And I've said this countless times. People have heard me say this. We're talking about their grandkids. We're talking about the folded flag on their mantle. We're talking about where they grew up, how they met. We're meeting their dog, the bird feeders they have in the backyard, the flowers in their garden. I helped a guy a couple weeks ago put his hedge trimmer back together. He was sitting there on the porch when I walked up, and he had a weed whacker, and he was trying to refill the line. He didn't know how to do it. It had an auto feeder, and so let me help you. And I had 2 hours on my calendar set aside. These kinds of people need that. They need to, because they're sold constantly, and they don't have that personal connection with people. And so I love on them. I go in there and I love on them. We just visit, and so because of that, then I go in, and the second thing is, do not get into a tug of war. That's why I think the concept thing you're talking about, conceptual selling, is great. Let's talk about a concept versus, somebody says, well, I'm so excited because we wanted to pay off the house. I don't even answer that question. I don't say, well, we're not going to pay off the house. What we are going to do is cover the payment. No. That's never, ever, that's not a sale. And they might not even need it. What if they got $300,000 in cash in their savings? What are we doing selling them a $5,000 policy anyway? You know what I mean? And so if you get into a tug of war where it's just product vomit, it does this, it does that, it dices, it slices, it just leaves a bad taste in your mouth, and it doesn't help them. And oftentimes they don't want it anyway because they feel like they're being sold. So if they need the concept, then the concept works. And if they don't need it, it's okay. And that has worked for me.
Awesome. Well, guys, thank you so much, David Crocker, for your contribution. I mean, I think that we'll see a large spike in sales from this. So, guys, I hope you guys introduce this yourself to your clients, and for your leaders to make sure that you guys put your people on these calls, because they can only get better from hearing people like, my goodness, Dave Crocker, he's doing a phenomenal job. So thank you guys for tuning in. We'll see you guys next Saturday for another edition of the Elite Producer Bootcamp, 9 a.m. Eastern Time. Let's go out and make it happen, guys. Have a good day.